This episode is brought to you by AudioQuest, makers of the mythical series Analog Interconnects. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Today we're talking about the speakers that you can see behind me. They are vintage styled two-way from PSB in Canada, and they are based upon a speaker that they made in 1974 called the Passif II, passive with a F or with an F at the end. And this new one's called the Passif 50. The 50 refers to 50 years of PSB in the loudspeaker design business. I guess the most obvious feature at the outset when you look at a pair of Passif 50 is the woven cloth grills that make them look like they're from a bygone age. But because this is a 21st century speaker, they are magnetically attachable. There's a nice little pull tab on the bottom actually. And also because this is a 21st century speaker, designer Paul Barton, who's a legend in loudspeaker design as far as I can tell, he has applied 21st century design techniques to this speaker. This is not your grandfather's PSB. And that means he's paid more attention to the internal bracing of the cabinet and the reduction of cabinet torque. And as well as technological advances in loudspeaker design, the Passif 50 also come with effectively 50 years of inflation. So this pair, this new version, sells for €3,000 a pair. And if we wind that back with an inflation calculator back to 1974 prices, it comes in at a roughly €500 a pair. So straight into sound quality, I think the Passif 50 are very clean and even-handed in their presentation of music. They might even be a touch cool, but they're definitely not what you would call a squeegee clean, wiped window on the music. And one of their strongest suits from the outset is dynamics. And those strong dynamics might be because these Passif 50 are 89 dB sensitive. Their nominal impedance is 6 ohms. The minimum is 4 ohms. And right out of the gate, I pegged that the Naim Uniti Atom was not really the right amplifier choice for the PSB. I find it too punctilious, too edgy in its presentation when paired with these Passif 50 loudspeakers. So I had to cut over to something else. And that something else was the Hagel H590. Yes, I know it's an outrageously expensive amplifier, but its smoother, slightly richer presentation was a much better fit for the PSB. But that's not what I landed on for most of my listening. I was just trying to find something that would not be as punctilious as the Naim. Oh my God, this is not even an amplifier review. But anyway, I went back to a Peachtree GAN 400 power amp fed by a PSB Audio BHK Signature pre-amplifier as my amplifier setup. So I guess what I'm saying here is you want something that is a bit smooth and rich, I think, if you're going to find the right amp for these speakers. And that's all I'm going to say about amplifiers from now on because I've said too much. And I think appearances can be deceptive because from the outset you might look at this speaker and think it's going to sound mushy and warm, a bit like a 70s vintage speaker, but it isn't. And I started out by comparing it to the Mission 770. So yeah, we're into side-by-side comparisons already. And the PSB I found could go toe-to-toe with the 770 on detail dig, but with a heavier lean towards that sort of window wipe transparency than the Missions. To me, the Passif 50 sound more lucid and less romantic than the 770. I'm not saying the Mission are a romantic, musical, oh God, kill me, speaker, but I think you would describe, maybe if we're going to pick up on that language, on those cliches, you would describe the Passif 50 as a more sort of accurate or more neutral sounding speaker. Oh God, a little bit of my internal audio file just died, I think, just saying those words. But anyway, moving on. Another difference is the Passif 50 don't pop the sound into the room as effectively as the Mission 770. But by contrast, the PSBs give us a better look at the sort of recording space and the ambience. They're an area sounding loudspeaker than the Mission. There's also a smidge more crisp crunch in the sort of lower treble, upper mids in the PSB. Now maybe that's because Paul Barton has specified a 2.5 centimeter titanium dome tweeter in his speaker, whereas the Mission use a soft fabric or textile dome. And for you loudspeaker design nerds out there, want to know why there is like a fabric around the tweeter. Having spoken already to Paul Barton about this in a podcast, he explained it to me as that this is one way in which he can better improve the off-axis frequency response to the speaker. And if you want to listen to that podcast, I'll put a link, you know where, in the description box below. So what I'm saying here is that the PSB contrasts the Mission's polite intimacy with a more lively but more standoffish presentation or sound. But I'd also say, or also add, that the PSB's sound quality to my ears seems to be more recording quality or mastering quality dependent than the Missions. The Missions to me are more forgiving. They make everything sound fantastic. And I don't think that about the Passif 50 here. They're a bit more, what's the word? Cutthroat? I don't know. A bit more, cutthroat's not the right word. They're a bit more ruthless in terms of recording quality. Yeah, got there in the end. Now there are two areas where I think the Mission and the PSB diverge more, I guess more obviously really. So the PSB use a 16.5 centimeter paper mid-bass driver. And if you watch my Mission video, you'll know that they used a polypropylene driver. And the PSB don't have a port like the Missions. They have a passive radiator, which you might think is a third bass driver. It isn't. It doesn't do anything like that. It acts like a port. But even though both of these loudspeakers are what we would call large stand mounts, the PSB is narrower and taller. Now both speakers offer similar in-room sub-bass presence. I don't think either of them really need a subwoofer. Not really. I mean, you could, but I didn't feel the need to reach for one. But I did feel that, or did hear, that the PSB's sub-bass kicks a bit harder than the Missions. When it does show up, it kind of shows up with more hello. And that then feeds into a second difference in that I think the PSB offer greater avidity with dynamics than the Missions. And in many respects, they split the difference between the Mission and the Klipsch Forte IV, which is obviously a much more expensive loudspeaker. And that, for me, makes the PSB Passif 50 a better choice than the Mission for sort of straight ahead, four to the floor, no messing about, cold, clinical techno. Yeah, I'm smiling because I know that many audiophiles are going to be absolutely horrified with what I'm about to suggest as a recommended album. And it's by a chap called Regis who makes very sort of cold, clinical, straight ahead techno. And the album is called Gymnastics. This is the restored version. And it is, yeah, to most audiophiles, this would just be a musical affront. And this, I know this is going to do nothing for the people who don't pay close enough attention to my videos, who think that I listen to nothing but techno, which couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I do drop into my videos now. I make a conscious effort to put in like a Steely Dan or a Neil Young, just to kind of counteract this sort of public perception that all I listen to is electronic music. I love electronic music and I love techno, but that's not all that I listen to. But anyway, the Regis album is what I'm talking about when it comes to straight ahead techno. And many, many people are into this. There are many record shops, vinyl shops, dotted about Berlin that are dedicated to this kind of music. Now, I look around Berlin and I don't see any record shops dedicated to Steely Dan or Neil Young or audiophile recordings. I don't see it. But to techno, yes, absolutely I do. Now, in conducting a side-by-side comparison between the PSB Passif 50 and the Klipsch Forte IV, the first thing that we have to remark upon is that the Klipsch are twice the price of the PSBs. And they're also more forward-sounding, and the Klipsch also have more of a sort of live, you are there holography, which I don't think the Passif 50 have. And I'm doing this comparison because these two loudspeakers look very similar. They both have that vintage vibe. Now, PSB have made theirs deliberately to look like an older speaker because not many modern PSB speakers look like the Passif 50. Whereas the Klipsch loudspeakers, they've just kind of kept going with the same design that they've used throughout the decades, really, when it comes to their Heritage series. But the thing is about the Forte 4 is that I think they're a colored loudspeaker. And I'm not so sure they are very reliable when, for example, for me, reviewing amplifiers or components further up the chain because they're colored in some degrees. I'm not saying they missed anything because as far as I can tell, the Passif 50 give us just as much detail as the Forte 4. But crucially, I think the Passif 50, I mean, you can see that this is the case, that they'll be a much better fit for smaller rooms than the Forte 4. Because I think I'm really pushing the limits of what the Forte 4 can do in this room, 6 meters by 5 meters. I think the Passif 50 are a much tidier fit for the dimensions of this room and its acoustic makeup. Yes, I know it's treated, but not really in the low end. And I just think if I'm prepared to forego the sort of the Forte 4's pushing of sound into the room and listen to a sort of more laid back but not quite as dynamic loudspeaker but still very good, then yeah, the Passif 50 tick the aesthetic box really nicely, but they also gel better acoustically with this space. So am I saying that a €2,500 speaker is as good as a €4,500 or €5,000 speaker? Well, not quite, because when we get into the details of the PSB's aesthetics, we can see where the price compromises are made, right? Because everything is a price compromise. So if you look at the veneer on the PSB, to me it's not as nice as the finish on the Klipsch or the Mission. It doesn't look as realistically woody as those two more expensive loudspeakers. And the stands on the PSB, the little sort of short stubby ones, they're as basic as it gets really. They're wooden stands. We have to build them. They're like 3 pieces that just bolt together. Super simple, but they're nothing fancy. They're definitely not metal as the stands are that come with the Mission 770. Not that I'm saying we necessarily need metal stands. It's just that when you get close up, you're like, oh yeah, they're wood. And it just makes the PSB look more, well, I guess look less luxurious, but less luxurious than a $4,500 or a $5,000 or a $6,000 speaker. I'm being a little bit unfair today, on the PSBs, because I've chosen 2 speakers to compare to them that are more expensive by quite some margin. But I've chosen these speakers because they fit with this theme of vintage looking loudspeakers, mid-century modern looking loudspeakers, right? That's why I've gone with these 2 side-by-side comparisons today. And also because I don't really have another $3,000 stand mount, or floor stander for that matter, in this house. So it kind of forced my hand into comparing them to the Mission and the Klipsch. And if you're wondering, how do the PSB compare to that other speaker that you can think of? I don't know. I don't have that other speaker that you can think of. It's not here. Sorry. So the Mission 770 look better than the PSB Passif 50. Do they sound better? I don't think it's really clear cut. They sound different, and I've described those already, but if I was forced to choose which one is better, I really couldn't do it. And it's the same with the comparison to the Klipsch. The Klipsch are more dynamic, they're more forward, but I think that would annoy as many people as it pleases. And because the PSB are a little bit more laid back, or a little bit more standoffish and a bit cooler, but still strong with dynamics, I think that would please a different group of people. So it's really hard to say that one of these three speakers is better than all the others, certainly in terms of sound quality. And I think that's a real achievement for Paul Barton and the Passif 50, because it doesn't sell for as much as these more expensive loudspeakers. So the PSB Passif 50 for me is the retro speaker that could. It's the one that can challenge the big boys on sound quality, even if it can't challenge them on, I guess we would loosely call it fit and finish or aesthetics. So if you can't afford a Mission 770 and you can't afford a Klipsch, I would strongly recommend you go and have a listen to the PSBs, especially if you're into that sort of retro vintage design as I am. I'll be talking again about these speakers in a video down the line, because when the NAD C3050 LE turns up, we're going to do like a system video for that. But if you liked this video, then please consider giving us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio in that looks matter, the look of our loudspeakers matters hugely, I think, to most of us. Only the real sort of die-hard audiophiles that would sacrifice everything at the altar of sound quality would probably argue otherwise. And I'm not really talking to those kinds of people on this channel. I mean, you're welcome to watch, but that's not really what I'm going after here, because what I guess my message is, especially in a few recent videos, is that the aesthetics of hi-fi gear might not matter as much as the sound quality, but it is a significant component. Maybe 30%, maybe even 40% of the factors that we look at when we're deciding what to buy. Because as I've said many times before, loudspeakers are pieces of furniture that make sound. They're the one thing that we absolutely have to look at. I have to look at these all the time when I'm sat right here listening to music. And I like what I see. They look great. Anyway, I'm rambling on. If you like all of that, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching. And I guess the most, and as well as technological, no, I'm not going to say that again, because I'd taken the monitor, no, not at all. No, let me do that again. So what I'm really saying here is that the PSB contrasts the Mission 770s, no, sort of, oh God, I can't get this right, polite intimacy. A little bit of a rant there.